Hello, welcome to the third edition of the Crossbench at More United. This is the weekly political chat show where we look for common ground on divisive issues. In a week where there's plenty of divisive views on who's responsible for the latest leaks in Westminster and Washington, we'll be talking specifically about poverty, taking a look at Britain's connectivity and asking some of our guests for their candid advice to a new Prime Minister. We're joined by Kevin Hollinrake, the Conservative MP for Thirsk and Malton. Ian Murray, Labour MP for Edinburgh South, and Liz Savile-Roberts, the Plaid Cymru MP for Diffour Merioneth. Is that how close?
Diffour Merioneth.
It's great to have the three of you here. As I just indicated a moment ago, there's been a lot of chat in the papers about who's responsible for leaking the telegrams of the British ambassador to the States. And one of the things I wanted to ask you before we kick off and get into some of the issues is we're going to have a new Prime Minister in a couple of weeks, and obviously ambassadors are well known for giving very candid advice. So if I could ask you what the most candid advice you would like to offer the new Prime Minister would be, and I'll kick off probably throwing that one to Ian, if that's okay.
I'm tempted to say resign, but this is what's been on party political. The most candid thing I think you could say to any Prime Minister is to try and do fewer things better. There's a temptation to do lots of things badly, but a real focus on some of the issues we'll probably talk about tonight, maybe poverty or economic development or some of the big infrastructure challenges, and to focus on them and to actually show some real achievement between day one and, say, day 100 would be my advice. My other advice would be please put around you the widest possible number of views and don't fall into what I think all Prime Ministers and all leaders fall into, is their circle gets diminishing all the time by people who tell them what they want to hear.
Okay, Liz, what would your candid advice be?
Politics isn't a game, and it isn't a matter of personalities. The decisions that are made here don't just affect the immediate people that the new Prime Minister, that he will know. It affects people who he will never meet, and it's his duty of care to make sure that he has the full understanding of the repercussions of the decisions he makes, and that he's not playing a game.
Kevin?
Yeah, I mean, some very valid points. I would say the most important thing with any leader is surround yourself by the right people. So build the right team, and that wants to be broad, a broad range of views, so not listen to you're in a circle too much, as Ian was saying. And I think the more you make, one of the frustrations I've had in the last 4 years of being a Member of Parliament is lots of things are kind of announced on the floor of the House or in the newspapers, new government legislation, on issues you know something about, and you think, well, nobody ever even asked my opinion if it was something. So there's lots of experiences in the House, on both sides of the House. Reach out to people on both sides of the House and try and get a good understanding of what the best thing is to do and what views are on doing it. Some proper debates in the House before you push those policies out. And I think this is what More United should be about. It should be really listening to each other rather than just the Punch and Judy show. If somebody stood up, here's a good idea, the other side bashing it, which is whoever's in government has been the approach in the past.
I thought the one bit of advice would have been to make you Chancellor. I thought that would have
Well,
been
that was
the one bit of advice you give to the Prime Minister.
The best advice never comes direct from the horse's mouth, of course. But it's good to see so many nodding heads with those kind of suggestions for the new Prime Minister. Just before we move on, we're always really keen to get as many questions as possible from people watching the Crossbench live, so please do start sending in your questions now. You can ask questions about anything, but we're going to focus particularly on poverty as one of the issues being ignored because of Brexit this week. Just before we move on, and I always say we try to not to talk too much about Brexit, but it's always impossible to ignore it entirely, and I'm conscious that there's a by-election taking place at the moment, and Liz, your party and the Liberal Democrats are kind of in a bit of a pact around that by-election, and that's an example of cross-party working at the extreme at an election. I just wanted to ask how straightforward it was for you to, as a party, to make the decision to work together.
And to be fair, the Greens and Change UK as well. We have worked with the Lib Dems this week. We've been talking about how best to operate this. Obviously, for a party which calls for independence for Wales, to be working with a unionist party really has put us in quite a difficult place with many of our natural supporters. But in all honesty, this is an extraordinary time in politics. We are a Remain party. We are campaigning for a second voice, a people's vote referendum. And for us, the possibility of there being the first Brexit MP in the United Kingdom coming from Wales that this called for extraordinary measures, which we have chosen to do in this time. We shall then see what happens if we have a general election later on this year, or what we've been expecting really for the last 3 years almost. So we shall see where this leads to.
Okay, well, time will tell, and it'll definitely be interesting times that tell as well, I think. I was looking at the news stories for things we could talk about that weren't leaks from Washington and Brexit, and I noticed that last week Jeremy Corbyn suggested, I don't know if he did it himself, but it might be time to renationalise BT. And I'm not going to ask you whether it is time to renationalise BT, but I'm conscious that you're from disparate parts of the United Kingdom, and you will have different understandings of how well connected people are in the UK and how important that is for our economy. So I just wondered, not if you would renationalise BT, but if you think that we're doing well enough as a country at the moment in making sure that people are connected. And Kevin, you were nodding and shaking your head at the same time.
I was already okay. That's it on the fence, isn't it? No, definitely not. We are well enough connected. Nowhere near. I represent a rural area, and it's the same in lots of areas, not just rural areas. We are way behind the game in terms of fibre to premise. You have full fibre, so you can really experience the internet how it is even today, and the use we'll be making of the internet tomorrow will be in areas we haven't even thought about. But we know we'll need more bandwidth. I think we have 7% penetration in terms of full fibre to premise, so houses, 80% I think in Spain, so nowhere near enough. And so what we need to do, the government needs to step in certain areas, especially in rural areas, I think, where there's market failure, where people aren't just digging holes. I see in London, you see Gigaclear and other people digging holes in the street, putting fibre into houses. At my apartment here, has got a full fibre connection. You've got a choice of 2 or 3, but in rural areas you've not got that. So we need to step in, and myself and cross-party MPs have signed a letter recently to the Secretary of State to say put some more into not just broadband but also mobile phone connections, 4G, 5G that we need. So we do a lot more. We also need more competition in the marketplace. The only one thing worse in my view than a public sector monopoly is a private sector monopoly, and that's what you've had with BT for some time. So we need to get more competition. That's happening. Needs to happen more quickly. We need to facilitate that.
And is that an experience that you shared for you?
I think, again, we have to stand back and look at what do we think the state can do or should do, which the open market won't do. And when we come to rural areas, that's exactly it. Now, I represent a constituency which includes much of Snowdonia National Park, and there has been great public expenditure with EE on the emergency services network, which is obviously what the police and ambulance use to pick up signals. And EE then put their own equipment on that. Now, there is an obligation on them to allow other companies to come in, but the reality is in that area, they're not big enough because there's a planning restriction.
Yeah, that's right.
Now, surely in areas like the National Park, the state should be standing and saying, right, they will be roaming here, because commercially, what is there to use? And people, we're dependent on tourism. People come in with their different mobile phone companies.
Yes.
They're not going to buy EE just to go on holiday to Snowdonia.
That's right.
So what is to lose? And we have everything to gain. And at the same time, our rural areas are being effectively left behind because what is normal here is assumed to be normal everywhere, but it isn't.
Sure, dead right.
Ian, I would guess Edinburgh South is probably slightly better connected than Thirsk or North Wales. Is that fair?
Well, yes and no. I mean, I think the penetration in South Edinburgh is only about 97%, and that 3% can't get fibre. It's important we talk about what fibre actually is, and a lot of the advertising that goes on television and for some of the providers isn't actually full fibre. Fibre should be straight into the home. But it shouldn't be about whether or not that we argue about whether it's completely and utterly privately operated or completely and utterly publicly operated. But the government has to regulate to hit the spots that it can hit. And it's not just about rural areas not having the connectivity. We're just about to go into an era of 5G where it's going to be crucial to have that if we're going to have automated vehicles, if we're going to move into complete connectivity for artificial intelligence and the economies of the future. I'm on the Foreign Affairs Committee, so travel a lot, and I can tell you in some of the places in the world where you would expect them not to have good connectivity, it's much better than my flat here in London or in Edinburgh. So I think government has to step in and regulate for those bits that the market will not do, and basically just force the market to do it, and that's the only way you're really going to get around it.
One thing the other frustration, I have a business background before politics, but you looked at two types of spending differently, whether it was investment spending or recurrent spending. Recurrent spending in your profit and loss, investment spending on your balance sheet that would return money in the future. Infrastructure spending, be it broadband, be it mobile phone signals in areas where the market isn't coming, whether it be transport, all these things. You can look at it in a completely different way, in my view. And we know that in lots of areas, lots of parts of the country, and in comparison to lots of other countries, we underinvest in infrastructure. And we should have a proper conversation about making those big investments in these kind of areas.
We had a question from, in fact, I know some people are struggling watching with their Wi-Fi at the moment, so we apologise for that, and in a way, I guess it's kind of apt. But we had a question from Barney in our inbox earlier on today. He didn't say where in the UK he was, but he was asking about whether our current electoral rules are fit for purpose. And the reason I've raised that now is because I know some people feel that our elections are a kind of critical infrastructure. And I wonder whether the three of you are comfortable. Do you feel comfortable right now that in a digital age, our elections and the rules around our elections and how we regulate those are fit for the purpose right now and maybe fit for the future?
Well, it seems to me if you can sit in your bedroom or on your toilet and transfer money between bank accounts, or I can transfer money to anybody sitting on this panel, then it shouldn't be, not that I've done that, no, it shouldn't be without the realms of possibility to find a system that is robust enough for people to interact with the electoral system electronically, online, through your bank cards, in some way that you've got some kind of personal identity. That way I think it would make it much easier. We must be the only place in the world that still asks people between a set period of time to go into the town hall and pick up a pencil and mark an X on a box. Now people should still be able to do that, but there must be a much easier way of engaging the public, and it can't be out with the realms of possibility to find a secure system.
Yeah, and we can hardly talk at the archaic system of voting in Westminster, where you have to walk through these lobbies, and it's funny, in the leadership election, of course, in our leadership election, the members of Parliament, Conservative members of Parliament, had to vote who they decided was the best person to represent, to go to the final two, to the membership. And you could ask somebody to vote on your behalf, so you could decide the next Prime Minister of this country, effectively, but you could give it to somebody else. You could say, I'm not going to be here yet tomorrow afternoon, and would you vote for me? You cannot do that in the Commons unless, I think it's paternity leave now, you can, but lots of other situations. So, very archaic system in here, and I agree with you. Archaic system in the wider country in terms of voting, so we should make it easier for people.
So we actually did some polling as More United a couple of weeks ago to look at what the public thought about potential changes in Parliament, because as all of you will be aware, Parliament has to move house at some point and live somewhere else temporarily. And we looked at whether things could be done differently in that time. And one of the things we asked the public was, would there be an appetite for MPs perhaps using electronic voting? And actually nearly 2/3 of people came back saying yes, they thought that would be a good idea. So there's definitely some public appetite for doing things differently using digital in Parliament.
Can I throw in a caution though? And I'm not against electronic voting as such, but I sit in the Council of Europe. We do electronic voting with everything they do. And 2 weeks ago, the Council of Europe sat till 2 a.m. going through 3,000 amendments voting electronically. We would never do that in the House of Commons. So if it's to save time, then I'm not sure it will be a mechanism to save time in the long run, because you would just vote on more things.
And 3,000 amendments must have been. I don't want to think how long the original piece of legislation must have been in. But we said we were going to focus this week particularly on poverty as one of the issues that's being ignored because of Brexit. And I wanted to ask start with a really simple question, and encourage people watching again to send their questions too. Which is to say, is poverty a problem in your constituency, Liz?
I represent the constituency that is either the lowest paid in the entire nations of the United Kingdom or hovering around the bottom, although it has very high, people are in employment. So one of my concerns within the United Kingdom, and just to very briefly touch on Brexit here, is the fact that we've had structural funds. Wales has been a net recipient in terms of structural funds from Europe, where there is a tradition of, there's a principle of considering inequality across the states of the EU and endeavouring to ameliorate that, to alleviate it. And we have really very little idea of where we're going in the future. And of course, if you're looking at productivity and actual deficits, the 12 regions, including the 12 regions, the nations and regions of the United Kingdom, the 3 that are not in deficit are all in the east or the southeast or London of England. So this isn't just a Wales or a Scotland question. I mean, this often gets thrown at Wales. Wales is dependent on England, what do you do? This actually is way beyond the way structurally the southeast of England is supported in infrastructure funding, in transport, a whole range of areas. We really need to be looking at that and questioning whether that, if we go ahead with Brexit, what the solutions will be, and are we in all honesty satisfied with that?
Okay. Kevin, how about in those from Malton?
Yeah, very very similar to Liz. You know, we it looks a very beautiful area. There's lots of nice houses there. It's beautiful. You know, it looks like a lot of prosperity. But lots of people on low wages. Lots of people in the agriculture sector, food processing sector, which are notoriously lowly paid. And we've got very high house prices. So it's that double whammy. And I think there's 4 million people in the UK that are in poverty after housing costs, so purely as a result of housing costs. It seems such an easy solution to that. And like I was saying before about investing in infrastructure, to me housing is infrastructure. And to build homes at truly affordable levels, social rent, is something we absolutely should be doing. And we could really bring 4 million people, including lots of children, out of poverty in a very short order. So yes, it's an issue, but yes, we've got the tools to address it if we've got the political consensus.
Ian, in Edinburgh?
Yeah, I mean, Edinburgh South has 2 or 3 of the richest streets in Scotland and 2 or 3 of the poorest, and it just shows you that dearth of equality across the constituency. But you know, housing is one of the big ones that Kevin's mentioned, but also I think there's in-work poverty is one of the biggest challenges that we could resolve relatively easily. It just seems to me completely incoherent to have, and I don't just want to pick on major companies because that would be unfair, but to have people in work, working 40 hours a week and unable to live, at the same time the state is handing those individuals tax credits and those kinds of subsidies to their wages, and then there's significant massive profits going from those companies into the pockets of shareholders. Now, that's the way this system works, but it surely can't be beyond the wit of us to look at this as a parliament and to say, if you're in work and working 40 hours a week, you should not have to have a state subsidy for those wages. And we have to do something about that. And I think the other thing that's connected to poverty, and something that we haven't really looked at for a long time, is that social mobility and that poverty of opportunity, and being able for people to strive through their lives by education and through the higher education system and moving on to further education, and giving them that opportunity to move on. So you've got to lift the very bottom, and you've also got to make sure people are paid properly, and there's an opportunity for progression. And I think we're really bad at that in the last 10 years in this country.
And you mentioned at the start of your question that it would be fairly easy to fix it, the in-work poverty problem. Is it as simple as wages? What's the easy fix?
Well, it's 2 things. It's probably 3 things, but it's definitely about just the basic wage. Secondly, it's about training, and thirdly, it's about progression in the workplace. And you've got the gig economy now, which is overlaying all of that when people aren't actually employees at all. They're just working on a very ad hoc basis, and I think we have to deal with the labour market as a whole, trying to find a way through this. It just seems strange that the same people who are working 40 hours a week might be paying their taxes to give to the government for the government to give them back in some kind of subsidy to the employer. That's a crazy system. Although I would say, just a little footnote to that, without that support, poverty in this country would be significantly worse. So you can't just take it away without making sure people can feed, clothe and house themselves.
And Liz, wages, training, career progression, is that a prescription that you would be in agreement with?
I think, forgive me in one respect, I'm referring back to my previous career. I used to work in further education. But I think the lack of emphasis that we have given to people who are not going to go into academic education, alongside the fact that people are going to be working for possibly a decade, perhaps longer as we move ahead than their parents would have done, and that they're going to need, people will not be able to do the physical hard work that they may be doing for the first 20 years of their lives. So how are we going to enable people to carry on working? What is the work that is going to be there for them? And how do we train them? FE has always been the correlation. A, it hasn't got the status for vocational qualifications that you would see, say, if you went to Germany. And B, it hasn't had the funding either. And that, looking back, seems to have been one of a real weakness that we cannot allow to continue, because surely for a healthy society, everybody, whatever their academic ability, should be able to aspire to better themselves and to have a story that they can tell themselves that they'll be able to better their children. And if we can't aim to provide that then we are making weak spots in our society which are going to break.
I've got a question come in from Tom in Leeds, who's come into the inbox, and he's asking about universal credit. And I think everybody knew that when universal credit was announced that there were several issues with the rollout, and there's been a lot done to try and fix those initial issues. Has enough been done to solve the issues around the rollout of universal credit?
No, it hasn't. I mean, universal credit, I think most people accept it's a good idea in principle. It took some of the old kind of, there were some very adverse consequences by working too much in the old system, very high tax rates for working too much. So this is a system where you should be able to work more and earn more. But, I mean, my area, for example, it was rolled out in 2017. Lots of people are paid 4 weekly. So you're paid 4 weekly. And so you can get paid twice in the same month on universal credit. You can get so your salary can get paid twice in the same month if the timings are a certain order. And universal credit just sees that you're earning twice as much as you were, and universal credit drops away completely for that month or to a significant degree. That's just a clumsy system. So we could fix lots of things like that. The payments, the first delay on payments is too slow, so it creates pressure, gets people behind on things like the rent. So lots of things we could improve the system, but fundamentally, we've got the taxpayer has some massive challenges ahead. This is healthcare, social care, pensions, because of the demographics. So there's only so much burden the taxpayer can take. So I think in terms of, as Ian and Liz were saying earlier, we need to make sure wages are higher rather than the taxpayer subsidising employers. So we should be moving towards a real living wage. So we're going to have to work more, but we should earn more and keep more. So we lift the level of the tax threshold so people on low incomes pay little or no tax. All those three things should make it easier for people on low incomes to then progress. As if your home life is stable, your finances are stable, you've got a decent place to live, then you can start thinking about taking on a new career, new learning, hopefully, but more aspirational for your children in terms of their education. So it's hopefully a virtuous circle at that point.
I'm interested to know, Ian, Liz, would you agree with everything Kevin's just said?
What my experience has been with people I've dealt with universal credit is it very much depends on the discretion of the officers who are supporting them and the amount of support that they have. And there are some fundamental things. Evidently, I have an issue with the rape clause and the number of children having to. That seems to be fundamentally unjust. But there are, say, issues with having the head of the household as the sole claimant, and issues of domestic abuse, and even seeing people who've been in prison, how if this isn't managed properly, they can come out and they've lost the payment for them and their partner to have rent at home. I am worried that there will be underlying pressures on the officers who will be able to make this better for those very vulnerable individuals, that they don't do so. When they can, then it works well. But I could come back just to the same. We're talking about infrastructure and claiming online, and some of our areas, you just can't do that.
Sure. I'm conscious you pointed out a whole host of other problems with universal credit there, and on the things that Kevin pointed out, I didn't hear you say you disagreed with anything that Kevin had said previously, but I'll leave that hanging. Ian?
Well, I mean, I think I don't, because I think the benefit system's hugely complicated and it's been built on top. It's like a 20-storey tenement now with all the different bits, a different apartment, and at one point it will collapse. So if the principle is to simplify the benefit system to make it more responsive to claimants, and to make a system that seems fairer to claimants, then nobody would disagree with that. It depends what the principle is that you're doing this for, and to be fair, and again, we're trying not to be political, but if the government's principle when designing a new system is to save money, then there's a difficulty in how you design that system and then how it's rolled out. If your principle is just to simplify a system to make it better for people, and I'm not sure that's what the government's principle was, then I think we could all agree that you could come around the table and try and find a way of getting cross-party agreement on that. But it's huge. I've been an MP now for 9 years, and I don't understand the system still, because every single individual claimant's circumstances are different.
And just one last question on poverty, Kevin, to you. When you talk about increasing wages, is that easy for employers? I mean, some employers will be working fine margins, and you say, well, employers need to put the wages up, and a living wage would be a real living wage would be a fantastic thing. But that places a real challenge on employers. So, what can employers do to get into a position where they can pay that?
Yeah, I mean, you've got to do it progressively. It's true. Otherwise, it could have adverse consequences. People put out of work, and actually, it's not just private sector. We tend to think of this in the realms of the private sector, but actually, lots of pressure on schools and education and healthcare. And social care came as a result of the rise in the minimum wage, which is rising much faster than the rate of the other increases in wages. So no, it's got to be done progressively, but it's absolutely the right thing to do. And business can adjust over time. And what businesses should do, and I'm still in business to this day, is they become more productive. Our people need to become more productive. We've got a massive productivity problem. The amount of output the average worker produces in their working week is much lower than France and Germany and the US, which holds back wages. So we've got to have our employers and our business people that are more understanding how to get the best out of their workforce. A lot of that is training too, training at the management level. So is it easy? No, it's not easy. Can it be done? Yes, absolutely can be done. And I think there's a real consensus in Parliament that's the direction of travel we should be moving in.
In fact, what I have businesses locally to us complaining about business rates.
Yeah.
So they will complain that
Sure.
if with the living wage that they've been required to pay more, but they're complaining in relation that is taking more out of the money that they have.
Yes.
If there was a balance in terms of they were paying less elsewhere, I don't think that there are employers who per se would wish. I have some who are proud to be paying the real living wage, and to be praising that and to be enabling that. To look at how we can save in other respects is really... And what I will have, again, in an area which is very dependent on tourism, they say that Airbnb or people with second homes who are just renting them out and nobody's catching up with them, they're not paying tax, they're not paying council tax either, and they're below the threshold to pay business rates. So the businesses who are upfront and transparent are being hit by others who are, frankly, gaming the system.
Sure.
So I'm conscious of the time. I want to apologise to a couple of people, Kevin and Peter and Georgina, for not getting round to their questions on proportional representation or Brexit. Brexit for obvious reasons. But I just want to close with a last question. We try and ask a bit of a fun question to end on the crossbench, which I know is every politician's favourite moment in any chat show. This week is International Cocktail Week. And so I want to say at the outset, mocktails are a perfectly allowed answer to this, but if I was stood behind the bar and it was the end of a long, hard week in work, and you were to order your favourite cocktail, what would I be mixing up for you?
Well, before I was an MP, I actually had my own bar, so I'm a trained mixologist.
Wait, in that case, Ian's making the drinks.
You can do all the jokes for us.
And I would love to make you a mojito.
Brilliant. I'd enjoy that, and if the sun was shining even stronger, I'd enjoy it even more. Kevin, what's your...
I'd love to drink a mojito, one of my absolute favourites, or a Moscow Mule. But in a tribute to a friend of mine who I lost a few years ago, I'd have to say it's Jack Daniels and Coke. It's not exactly a cocktail, but it was his favourite drink, and I always try to have one of those on special occasions.
And this?
We have a homemade version of Aperol Spritz, which is basically anything that's in the fridge that you can mix with Aperol. And hopefully a bit fizzy.
I imagine that comes out quite tasty from time to time. Thank you to all three of you for joining us on this week's Crossbench. It's been a pleasure to have you on, and we look forward to being joined by everybody again this time next week when you'll meet a new host.